So before I talk about the components that is involved in the RESTful API testing, I would like to explain you what the process is actually. So you would be working as a user, that you'd be touching your computer, using your browser, you're doing some request, you are submitting some form, or you whatever actions you're doing, maybe you're trying to retrieve some informations. So in all other sense, whatever actions you do, you are expecting some form of response to you, which means you need some answers or some informations. So these things all come from the server. So what happens is, when you are into this computer, when you are doing some things here, and when you click the button, this basically sends the request into the server in order to get the information based on the information that you provided. Once the server receives these all information, it will do lots of the validations, and based on whatever params you have, whatever thing you are trying to ask, it will then respond back to you. Okay, to take this as a simple example, let's say you are trying to log in into the applications, and you just type in some valid password. Then the server will say it is authenticated, and it will send back to you into UI, right? And then once UI authenticates this, that's when you can actually get inside this. You could be already logged in and you are trying to get more information from the database, or you are trying to get submit some form applications. All of your information is then gathered and it will be sent to the server. So when you see into the UI will have all user understanding data, which means what you could understand and easily readable. But when it sends back to this form of the server, then it will be totally machine readable data. So back in the days, it was always harder, like what's being actually sent, and it is harder to parse back to you, because the machine sends the different format and it will have to then parse back to this data. Back in the days, XML is heavily used in this sense, because XML would easily integrate with all kind of applications, right? In order to do that, JSON is also another thing. So what JSON become popular is then all of this converting thing happens into the JSON format. It's a JavaScript format, right? So JSON format, which is basically nothing but key value pair of the information that you are wanting. So what happens in the HTTP world is, you as a user, you are trying to send some information to the server in order to retrieve some more information. Then you are sending as the user, and once this is formed as a request, it will then convert it into the JSON format. Once it is converted to JSON format, it will go back to this server, and then server will then based on the information that you have gathered, it will send it back to the UI. UI is the backend response into the user interface. But what happens, this response is also into the JSON or XML format, but then UI has to render it. It will have to basically format it the way you would understand. But these things, if it is in the JSON format, then it will have a key value pair, which is basically the same format that it would be used in order to render the value into the UI. So this is the process basically we're trying to implement. So as a HTTP, as a user, you are trying to click the button and get the answers. But these days, you don't always want to rely into the applications, right? You want to get more step up and try to understand what happens behind the scene. For that purpose, we have something called API. API is basically application programming interface, which could be one way accessed via the UI as the user, and the other way is you could directly call into the server as a user, right? You don't need to go into the UI. You just directly as a user, you can just simply call it here, and the get response back to you the way you want it, right? And then once you get you send the request, it sends back to you. So this process is basically done via lots of tools like Postman or Fiddler or any of these tools that's available in the market, and there are so many RESTful client applications you can actually download. In terms of the automation, we're trying to do the same thing. So in order to do the automation for this, we will have to first make sure the request that this UI sends to you has to be generated via your script. And then once you get the response, then responding back to you and validating should also be handled by the automation. So in order to do that, you will have to first understand, okay, here we're talking about RESTful API, so which would basically focus on the JSON format. We're going to talk more into XML and more of the WSDL stuff in the next other videos once we're done with the RESTful. So please focus on that. So once you get this thing, right, this communicating thing will happen into the JSON format. So that JSON format, you will have to be really familiar with how to write and how to convert the JSON format. In order to do that, I have some videos uploaded already so that you can start getting familiarized with the JSON format and don't get more surprised when you see this. So this is basically the background of, right, this RESTful API and the component, how the process would work. So let's go with the actual components that you will need to understand, or you will see more frequently in the coming videos. Okay, so I'm going to just simply remove this. I hope you get that. So one of the first thing you'd need is endpoint. Endpoint is basically nothing but the URL. So URL is the URL that what you just saw. In fact, I'll keep those emails so it will be much easier. We can do that here. So the endpoint has two types of, it's called URL, right? So URL are of two types. One is a user interface, which is a UI where you'd be typing www.google.com, and another is the server-side URL, which is called endpoints. The server-side URL is the URL that actually introduces this. User interface URL is what this is about, where as an end user you will be accessing into. You don't have direct access to the server. So in order to get the data from here, you will have to go through the UI, which is a user interface website URL, like a www.facebook.com, right? And whatever actions you do here, that is sent into this. So what this will include is, it will include some sort of components. That is what we're going to talk about. One of that component is the endpoint. It will have to request into the endpoint where that data actually is going to be, because server is huge. It has so many data, so many components inside the server, right? So many components. So it could have component here, it could have here, it would have everywhere basically, right? So you want to make sure those are properly aligned and you are actually pointing into the right place where you are actually looking the data to, right? Maybe this is the data that resides here, right? So you want to get this right place. So in order to do that, you'd have something called uniquely identified URL, only designed for the server, which is called endpoints. So endpoints URL is a little bit different than what you'd be accessing into the UI. So what this does, your action is sent into the endpoint, including the request. Okay, including the request. So we'll go through that next. So one is the endpoint, which is also the URL. So this now it's not that component, so let's remove that. And next thing is HTTP method. So when the codes are being developed as a backend, it will have to identify this endpoint URL into some sort of method. Whenever they create the controller, which is the endpoint, whenever they create the endpoint, they have to identify or they have to define what type of endpoint method that is going to work as. So there are different type of methods which you can find, which is called get. Let's to capitalize this. Yeah, but post. And by the way, get and post are the mostly used, which you may only need to use this tool and not even see the other one in real life. However, we're going to look more into that. Put is the other one, and basically the delete, because with the post you don't want to just go and delete. So here get is just to get the information. Basically this is just the read only. You are actually reading the value, that's all you do. Post is basically you are trying to generate the new set of data, or you are trying to update the data. Put is basically changing or updating, which is what post will already do. Delete is just to remove the data. Okay, so these are the 4 sets of the method that it will work as, right? It will work as these 4 sets of the data. So now this is what that will include into. Okay, this will say this endpoint, whatever you send, that endpoint has the some form of URL. So to give you example, I'll just do this one quick URL. So this is one of the endpoint URL where you can access some informations, which is basically the endpoint. So this endpoint is identified as a get. You will know, but that's how it is developed in the backend. We're going to talk more about the API stuff in the other videos, but this is just to cover the components piece. So next thing is, once you get this endpoint URL, this is already defined into get. So what this means is, when you have to request this URL in order to test it, you can only do it with the get type of request. So this get type of request will be sent into authentication. So if it requires authentication or it is not required authentication, you'd have to get that. Just say you don't want to just have user anybody just directly access the information directly by calling the endpoint, then you want to authenticate that, right? So those things may also happen. If it doesn't happen, the authentication, then you can directly access it. We're going to just show you this. So when I get that URL here, when I just simply paste it, this is, let's say this is the endpoint, right? So this endpoint is unsecure, it is free for anybody. It is just a dummy. Basically it will just give you an idea about what type of URL this will contain, right? So if we do this, it's gonna get so many form of data, but now you want to filter that out, right? You can just filter that out and just see one employee. Basically it is just showing the information of the employee. So this type of information you don't want to show it to everybody, you want to hide it. In order to do that, because that was dummy, it wasn't secure, but usually it will be secure to get that form of data. So that's another thing which you might want to see it, which is authentication. We will get more into different type of authentication that you will be required sometimes, and that's not always the case, by the way, because not always you'd be using the API testing. So next one is a content type and accept, right? So when you send that request into the server, you'd have to define what type of content it is going to send, and when it gets a response, how is it supposed to accept, right? Okay, so other one is the request. So request will contain the headers, body, right? So request is basically nothing but the request that you are actually sending into the server, into the endpoint. This endpoint you are trying to send the request. This endpoint is nothing but the server. In order to get that request, you have to get some form of request body, which is this piece of information will be in the JSON format. Okay, that's the JSON format. You'd have to send the request into the JSON format, and then you would have to set that up before you are sending, otherwise it will not work. Okay, so once you send the request into the JSON format, then also what you get next one is Once the request is sent, you'd see something called, this is very important, responsive status. We're going to talk more about the different codes on the responsive status. This is nothing but the code. This code will be identified as 200 being okay, or 201 being, or anything range in the 200 being okay, 400 being bad request, 500, right, being like a server error, or so something that is out of your control, could be something issue with the server, something like that, right? So it has some different form of codes, and we're going to talk more about as we go further. But again, so there are some response status that's actually telling you what happened to the request that you sent. Was that the good request or bad request, or are you getting any response, things like that. So normally what happens is when you get the response codes like 200, you will get some form of response. Okay, so which is what we call response body. Okay, so these are normally the things that you would have to understand. So when you see the response body, this will normally look like the JSON format. Let's see what it is. So this is what we just entered into the URL, but normally you don't access that into the directly into HTTP URL. This is just to demo purpose, but normally you would request it through the script, and you get the response into the into your response as an object, and then you will see that in like this format. This is nothing but the JSON format. So if you see here, a JSON format has a key, column, and then value. Everything is double coded, right? Employee name is a key, name is a test, employee salary is 123, employee age is 23, profile email something. So this is nothing but the response body. So when you request this into the URL, you will get this into the response. So this is because the get request, you don't see more about the post here. Normally if it is a post request, you'll have to create the JSON format request body, and then you need to send that request. So once you send that request, you get response based on whatever response it is supposed to get based on your post request. So I guess this is just going to conclude that this video. Let me just do the quick recap in order to understand the components. RESTful API testing. We talked about the UI. User will enter the information here, and that information is being sent to the endpoint via the endpoint to the server directly, and then server will, based on these params, what is provided, what is asking to look the information within its database, or it will do those validations, and then it will send the response back to you regardless of good request, bad request, or whatsoever. Another thing is called HTTP method. HTTP method is basically designed whenever this controller are made, these endpoints are made, it was then defined that what type of this URL is supposed to respond to the users. If it is get type of it will be just the read only, nobody can modify. If it is a post, that means you are supposed to update that into this URL so that it will change that information into the database. Put will do just change that, update the data. Delete will remove the data. Authentication is basically added authentication so that no other external users can just directly access to it or directly call the API and get the response and mess up with it. Content type and accept is basically the header sections where you would be able to set the content type and accept, so that the data or request you are sending, you are telling explicitly what type of content it should accept and what type of content you are actually sending. Request is nothing but the request body, so you are sending, because it's a get, you don't have more of the request, but you have a post type, you will see more of the request body into this JSON format where you are be passing the parameters that it is required for this endpoint. Okay, we're going to look into this more later. And now next thing is get and the post is the mostly used HTTP methods. Next thing is the headers. Headers is basically just the header that is part of the HTTP headers. We have a body. Request body is right below the HTTP headers into the request body, where it would contain the this type of information, and this you don't define. This you're gonna write the request body based on what this would ask for. Okay. And then response status is once you send the request to the server will do the validations and send it back to you. First of all, they will send including the codes, which is called response status. This status is like a code where you'd be just and it will just help you identify what happened to that, right, before you go through the structures and the more error details. Let's say you have a successful response code that as a 200, which means you should get some form of body or the information that you're looking for. Okay, now if this was the UI development and there was a user interface, then this is the information you get it from the UI server, and then the UI developers will then render these values and put it where that should be. So for example, employee salary should be in a blue letter and then blue color, and this should be bolder with the added with the dollar sign and so on. So right, these you can then format based on this whatever we get from the server. So that will be talking more and more in coming videos. Anyway, this is a very long video. This is just to give you an idea about this terminology that you will be hearing more often in my coming videos in order to do the API testing. I hope this video has been helpful for you to get more basic stuff to the RESTful API, but please continue to add comments and give feedback, so we'll get into your questions if you may have. And thank you very much for supporting my channel, and please continue to subscribe my channel and watch my video. Thank you very much. Looking forward to add on the more videos and talk more about this in future.